Buddy, this is preprocessing content, a review of common techniques. The goal of this is to just look at several of the common preprocessing techniques, simple twig logic, preprocess hooks, display fields, field formatters, and then custom twig filters and functions. And we'll look at this sort of same example across many of them just to see how they differ. And I'll try to talk about some of my preferences. Your mileage may vary there. Yeah, and we'll just explore the different methods. So first thing, who am I? I'm Eric Volkernick. I go by SunFD on Drupal platforms, Drupal.org, Drupal Answers, Drupal Slack. I'm a full stack Drupal engineer. I work at Dev Collaborative, and I live in Portland, Maine. My favorite color is purple. I like broccoli and kale, apples, bananas, mangoes, and blueberries and strawberries. The image on the right there is my cat Gloria. It's an artist's rendition. That's usually my avatar on Drupal platforms as well. Some propaganda here. These are my personal beliefs. I don't believe in capitalism, and I think whole food plant-based diet is a great way to help the planet and help you live a long, healthful life. My experience with Drupal, I've been working, well, first of all, I'm a computer science dropout in about 2011. I started working with Drupal 7 around then, pretty seriously, and then I've been working through various agencies since around 2013, so about 11 or 12 years now, 11 years. And one thing that I've learned is I've worked with a few different agencies. Different agencies have different preferences. Some of the agencies I've worked with, they don't do any twig templating at all. Basically try to do things in the interface with Display Suite, things like that. Other organizations, they override their twig templates 100% every time. So let's take a look here. The first thing, twig logic. I'm defining twig logic to just mean anything we do in any manipulation in a twig template. So even just like simple if statements, which, they are logic, right? An if statement. But these examples are fairly simple. And yeah, let's take a look at the first example. So our first example here is we just want to wrap a div around a published date field. And first, we only want to add the wrapping div if there's actually content. So you could say, hey, if content render produces something from my published date field, then add the wrapping div and render the content field itself. And one thing here is we're rendering it, and then we are sort of rendering it again. So that's sort of the downside there. But this is sort of the simplest example here. A little more complicated here, we're doing something similar, but we're using the author field here as an example, and we might have another field on our content type that says, do I want to show the author? And so we're needing to check if that checkbox has been checked, and then we want to check if the author field produces output, and then we add our wrapping div and render the field again. So here we can see sort of same idea with the sort of double rendering, and a little bit more complex. So you can see if we had a template with lots of these, it might get hard to parse. So then we're going to look at our third example here, which is sort of combining the first two examples. We need to add a wrapping div around the published date field, but we only want to do that if it produces output. Same thing for the author field. And then here we want to actually show an additional wrapping div around both fields. Again, if they both should be shown. So we can see sort of an if statement here at the top. Again, the combination of both of them, checking if the author field should be shown, then checking if it produces anything, and then we're checking if the published date produces anything, and then we add our first wrapper. Then we check if the published date field produces anything, then we wrap that and render the published date field. And then again, down at the bottom, should our author field be shown? Yes. Does it produce something? Yes. Wrap it, produce that. This, you can already see here, this is just two fields. And if we have this kind of logic in here, it becomes much more difficult to parse and sort of understand what's happening in the template. So one trick that I've learned that I like to do in these situations is break out. We're looking at the same scenario, but I like to break out and set some variables at the top of my template to sort of separate the logic from the templating to try to simplify the templating part. So the first thing I'll do is I'll render my published date, set that to a variable. That's going to help me resolve the double rendering issue where I'm only rendering it once. And then I'll set an additional variable, has published date, which I'll just check if, now I'll check rendered published date is real content. Real content is a filter provided by the twig real content module, and it will just check, basically it checks to make sure that the output is not, empty divs or some other elements like an image. An image doesn't produce sort of any inner content. It is the content itself. It parses through some of those. And so it will just check, hey, is this real content? If it is, it returns true. And then I'll do a similar thing down here for the author field. Again, I'll render it once, set that to a variable, and then I'll actually set a variable show author that does the logic for checking if the show author field should be shown. And then I have this, does it have an author, which is true if show author is true and the rendered author is real content. And then now when I go down to my twig templating, where I'm actually rendering the output, it's much simpler to follow. You can read this. If has published date and has author, show the wrapping div. If has published date, render the rendered published date. If has author, render the rendered author. That's much easier. You don't need to, understand anything that's happening down here. You just see the very simple English what's happening. And then I have some further references down here, just some, links to Drupal.org, where we have the twig functions included in Drupal core. You can use those in here. Twig filters. Twig tweak is another helpful module for twig functions and filters. It provides a lot of them out of the box to do a lot of things that you might want to do. And then again, the twig real content module, which I spoke about there. So twig logic is personally not one of my favorite methods of pre-processing content. One of the things that I don't really like about it is that all of this is sort of hidden from the UI side of Drupal, right? Especially if you're rendering fields independently. Now the fields don't align with maybe with the order that they're set in manage display, and you sort of get this disconnect, right? That said, sometimes it's useful. And yeah, let's look at preprocess hooks next. So preprocess hooks are PHP functions that allow you to alter the theme variables before they're used in the templates. So right before we get to our template, which we were just looking at, you can alter some of the variables here. These are, when I think of Drupal, I think of preprocess hooks. So these have been around forever. But let's take a look at some examples here for preprocess hooks. So our first goal here is just to add a class to links in a link field, and our link field is field link. So we can, implement the hook preprocess field. We can check in our variables to see if our field name is field link, the field we want to alter. And then for each of the items, we can go through and add the class, a button class to the link. This is great, right? You get your button class on the link. You don't have to mess with the templates. It's always going to be there. That's cool. Next, we have a sort of alternate approach, which is very similar to the other one, but instead of using a generic preprocess field hook, we're going to hook specifically into preprocess field link. So here we don't need to check that we're, acting on field link because this hook only fires for field link. So in here, same logic, looping through all the items in the link, adding the button class. Sort of in general, I feel like use as specific of a hook as you can when you're doing this sort of thing. It just makes it easier, especially if you have multiple fields. If we go back to the previous example, if I need to, if I'm altering 4 or 5 fields here, we get one hook, several if statements. Maybe the comment gets trickier because you want to comment what's happening in here. But in this case, you have one dedicated hook for each field. Makes it very simple to document. You don't have a bunch of nested if statements or anything like that. Yeah, moving on to our next example is we want to add something new to our render array. So in this example, we are adding a related articles element to the bottom of an article nodes. So here we're using hook preprocess node, and we're checking to see if the node is an article, and then we're checking to see if it's the view mode that we want. In this case, we're looking at the full view mode because that's the one for the page. And then we are adding a new element to the content array, which is what gets rendered in the twig template. And we're calling it our related articles, and we're saying it's a view, and it's showing the related articles view, the latest 3 display. And then here we're setting the weight to 100. That's the sort of weight of this element in the variable's content array. And so that will theoretically stick it at the bottom. But that's one of the downsides here is if you want to add a new thing to the render array, it's very difficult to sort of order it in the right place, right? And plus you don't see it on the managed display screen. So in this case, if we wanted to stick this like in the middle of the page, I really wouldn't advise this approach. It can be used for the bottom of the page. In this case, set just an extremely high weight, so likely it's going to be at the bottom, right? And then I have another example here, which is a conditional addition. So in this case, our goal is to add that same related articles element, but we're only going to do it if the field related articles field is empty, right? So there's a field on the content type where somebody can manually select, in this case, up to 3 related articles. If they haven't done that, then we want to just show a view that has the latest 3, right? So here we can start, again, checking to see if our field related articles field exists, as we only want to alter that. Next, again, same idea. We're checking to see if we're on our article node type and we're on the full view mode. And then we want to check to see if there are any related articles here. So here we use the element get visible children on the variables related articles element. And so that's a helper function from Drupal core. It's going to check to see if there's any, again, visible children here. So if there's anything in that field, and we're saying has related articles equals whether that's empty or not. So if there are related articles, it will be true. If there aren't related articles, it'll be false. And so then we're saying if there aren't related articles, then we want to go ahead and add an element to that field. And again, this is just our view here. Our view related article show the latest 3. Here, I'm just setting this key as in the default child of this element. You don't need that. That's just sort of so if somebody's looking at this in a different preprocess hook somewhere, they'll know that maybe it was added somewhere else rather than like a 0, which it would normally be for a field. So preprocess hooks are very powerful, right? You can do a lot with them. Drupal's used them for years. But one of the problems with them is that they can be anywhere. and a lot of them have several different uh, there are several different hooks that could alter the same field, right? So in this fourth example here, we're in preprocess node and we're altering the output of a field. But in a previous example, here we were in a field preprocess hook altering one field, and then in this example we were in a different preprocess hook altering a field, a different field-specific preprocess hook altering a field. And then when you think that these hooks could be in any module on your site or any theme on your site, you can start to see how you could get into a little bit of trouble here without sort of clear, documented guidelines for you and your team and your project. So those are some of the downsides to preprocess hooks. Also, they can't be configured in the UI, right? There's no way to turn it off other than by editing the code. So unless you have access to the code base and you understand it, you don't know what's happening or where it's happening. Next, we're going to go on to display fields. And so display fields are fields that are added to an entity's display that are not directly linked to a field on the entity. So most of the time, if you're editing the manage display field of your content type, etc., each item there corresponds to a specific field on your form. But display fields, at least how I'm defining it here, and I think how they're sort of generally known, is these are new additional things added to that display screen that don't necessarily correlate one-to-one with one of those fields. And so these, going back to our preprocess hooks, in one case we wanted to add a new related articles element to the display, and one of the downsides was that we didn't know about it on the manage display screen. It was difficult to get it positioned in the right place without sort of manually overriding the twig template. Display fields sort of work around that issue, right? Because now you have that element right in your manage display, and you can move it around, reposition it. You can turn it off if you need to. So they're really great for that. So I have some examples here. One is a simple display field, and these are, I should mention that. So these are for like if you're managing display without layout in Drupal. And then if you're using layout builder, we'll look at some examples after for how to do those, how to add those kinds of display fields. So first, one thing that's I think is interesting about these is these are a lot of these types of things in Drupal. When you upgraded to Drupal 8, they turned into plugins. But this is one of the only ones that I really know of that still uses an info hook and then another hook to actually add the element here. But if we want to add a new field, display field, we have to implement hook entity extra field info, and we would do this in our module. And then we need to define where the field is. So here we're saying, again, node, it should be an article. The entity type is node, the bundle is article, and then we want to say it's a display field, so not like a form display field. It's a display field. And then we need to give it a machine name here. I'm partial to always giving my machine names for things prefixed with my module. It's pretty common anyway, but even in cases where you might not need to, it's still helpful, I think. And then we just need to define some simple elements here. So we're going to define the label, just how it appears in the manage display, right? What sort of shows up in your list of fields, and then we give it a description. And then this visible key is whether this field should by default appear on be enabled in each of the displays and not sort of hidden in the hidden section. I think it's pretty rare that you'd want it to be true. I think it's generally best practice to set it to false always, so that if somebody wants to add this field to the display, they need to go in and manually drag it up and put it on. So that's how we define the field. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to, add the content for it. So for that, we use, hook entity type view, or it could be hook entity view if you were doing multiple fields, etc. But in this case, we're going to do hook node view because we're adding a node field. And here we just use display get component. So we're checking to see if my module related articles field is actually part of the display. If it is, then we just need to build its content here. And so build, we're adding to the build variable, we're setting my module related articles, that's the machine name of our field. And here we're just rendering that same view, related articles, latest 3. And now it's available as an option on our manage display screen. If we add it to the display, it will render as part of the content in whatever position we've dragged it into, and it's going to show the related articles latest 3 display. Similar if we go down to a conditional display field. So this is same setup as the previous one, but this is the use case where we only want to show it if the field related articles is empty, right? If they've manually chosen to feature some articles, we don't want our related articles that are automatic to display. So same idea here. If our display has our component, but this time we add an additional layer here of checking just if the entity even has the field, or if it's empty, if the entity doesn't have the field, or if the related articles field is empty, then we're going to go ahead and produce content for our related articles view. And now examples C and D here are the same thing, but these are using block plugins for layout display fields. So if you're familiar with plugins in Drupal, many of them have a very similar field to them. They are a PHP file that goes in a subdirectory of my module plugin, some other directory here. In this case, we're doing a block, so it's inside block. And then at the top, they have an annotation, which sort of defines its machine name, its label. You can define other things too. We'll look at one of the other things in a minute. And then often they have a class that extends some other base class. In this case, we're just extending the base block class. And then they will often have a build method here. So in this case, our build method is just to add our render array for our related articles display, which we've been doing, right? And this is very simple. We now have a block. If we decide to display it somewhere, it's going to render that view. And in this case, layout builder, we could drag it around, position it where we wanted it, turn it off. That's great. And then this second example is a conditional block display field. So this is the same example as before. We want to only show our related articles view block if the related articles field is empty or doesn't have any value. So the first thing we'll notice is in our annotation here, we have our ID, our related articles block, our label, related articles, and then we have context definitions. Context definitions are really cool. What they do is they will take, if you're adding this on a node, for example, we can define our context definition to get the node from context. So if we're on article number 123, our block is going to have access to that node, so we can do stuff with it here. And so now if we go back down into our build method, we can see we're getting node. We're loading it from the context value because we've defined it in our annotation up here. Drupal will add it to it. And then same logic as before. If it doesn't have the field, or if it has the field and it's empty, add our related articles content. If it does have the field and it has values, we're going to be down here. We're going to just return nothing because we don't want to show anything in that case. Another thing here is Display Suite module. They have their own. They've turned display fields into plugins for the regular manage display screen, not layout builder. So if you're using display suite, they have display suite fields. You don't need to use this hook info, hook build approach up here. You can just display suite as plugins. You can define them very similarly to how you define these blocks here. Next thing we'll look at is field formatters, and these are the formatting options you see on the manage display screen for each field, and they take the raw data from the database and then they output it in some way. An example would be, taking a link field's data that's stored in the database as a title and a URL, and then formatting it into an A tag, etc. So again, field formatters are great. Another great thing, because now you can control them in the UI. You can turn them on or off without needing to access code. So there's display fields, field formatters. A big pro for those is that you can configure them in the UI. You don't need to understand code to turn them on or turn them off, etc. So the first thing we'll do is we'll look at a simple example here. And this is an example to add a class to our link field links. Remember, we did this with the preprocess earlier. And so now we can see here we have these are plugins as well. So these go into the my module plugin field formatter subdirectory. You can see they also have an annotation like the other classes here, like the other plugins. Give it a machine name, give it a label. And then we can define, for this specific plugin type, field formatters, we define which field types it should apply to. In this case, it's just a link. We only want it to apply to links. And so we have our class, link with class formatter, and we need to define a few things here. One, we need to add a field to the settings form so that when you configure it, you can say which class you want to apply to the links. And then we need to define that as a default setting here. So we're going to say our link with class formatter extends the link formatter. So sort of do everything the link formatter class does, except the few overrides we're going to define here. And so in the first case, default settings, our default class is nothing. And then we want to merge that with our parent class's default settings. And then down here in the settings form, we're going to our form elements are the parent settings form plus our new class field to capture the class. It's a text field, label add classes to links. The default value is this get setting class, so we're loading our class from the field formatters configuration. And then again, a description here, enter a comma separated list of classes. So we're just doing one text field. You could add multiple classes to it. And then we have a setting summary. So this is, when you're on the manage display screen and before clicking the gear to edit it, you see some information about how it's configured. That's what this is all about. So again, we're saying get our parents elements, setting summary, load our class. If we do have a class, output it in the summary here. And then down here, this is where it gets a little bit different with different plugins. In the case of the link formatter, it has a build URL helper function. So we just need to alter that to also add our class. We don't need to alter the build URL itself, the build function itself. So the first thing we'll do is we'll use the parent to build the URL, and then we're going to load our classes from the settings. And then if we don't have any classes, then we're done, right? We don't need to modify anything. Let's just return the same URL that the parent would have. And then if we do have classes, then we're going to create an options array with our classes. And we're going to just separate the class string into individual items. This is a little unnecessary, but it will be, it can make it helpful if somebody does need to preprocess later. Then each class will be in a separate array item. It's easier to remove them rather than trying to snip into a string and pull out just the middle word, etc. And then we're just going to merge our new options array here, which just contains our new classes, with the old one, and then we're going to return the new modified view. That's great, right? That's a huge upgrade to the preprocess stuff. It's a little bit more code, right? So it's a little bit bigger lift for one instance. But in this case, you spend a little bit of time up front. Now you have this field formatter. Now you can configure it for any link field on your site. If you have it in a module, you can install the same module on multiple sites. Now that's configuration every time you need to add a class to a link. Whereas otherwise with preprocess, you would need to, each time you need to add a class, you would need to add a new preprocess function, or some logic into the preprocess function to add the new classes and the new context. And that, at the end of the day, if you need to do it 5 or 6 links, you probably end up with the same amount of code, except one's harder to maintain. You can't manage it through the UI. It's just a problem. So we're going to look at another simple example here. And this is our case where we want to display the related articles view element if the related articles field is empty. So in this case, we're, again, another field formatter. In this case, we're overriding the entity reference entity formatter. So this is the formatter where you would pick a display type for your reference entities to show. So you might say, show the teasers, etc. So we're overriding that. And we have, again, our annotation at the top. We're defining the name of our field formatter, its label, its description, and then we're saying which fields it should apply to, in this case, entity reference fields. And then in this case, we're going to modify view elements, because that's the, building the visual, the items that are displayed. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, render my parents' version of these related articles. And then if that returns nothing, if it doesn't return nothing, then it returns something. So we're going to return that. We don't need to add our view. If it returned to nothing, then instead we're going to render our view here. So that's pretty slick. That's pretty easy. But in this case, since this is very specific to the related articles field, and this is a field formatter that could be applied to any entity reference field, we can go down here to isApplicable method, which is available for many plugins, field formatters for sure. And then we can say, hey, since this is hyper-specific to the related articles, let's only make this field formatter available to the field-related articles. And so that's great. Now we have it configurable in the UI, but because this is hyper-specific, we don't want it to be showing up on every field, because that wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't want to, field authors is empty, somebody's displaying related articles there if the person didn't add articles. And then our last example for field formatters is the same case as the previous. We want to show a related articles view if no related articles are added, but this is a more generic approach that we can allow it for any entity reference field here. So same idea with the annotation, much longer machine name here. It's an entity ref with fallback view. The label, rendered entity with fallback view. We're going to render the reference entities or the configured view if the field is empty. Again, we're overriding the entity reference entity formatter. And so like our first example here, we need to capture some of this information. We need to capture the name of the view. We need to capture the view display to use. So here we define our default settings. Our new settings are view name and view display. And then we want to merge those with the parent's default settings. Similar to our link example, we're adding new fields to the settings form. The view machine name and the view display ID. And these are just text fields. Sort of an upgrade approach here would be if we wanted to get real fancy, we could get the views information from the database, turn this into a select list so people can only select from the existing views. This sort of simple approach is they just have to manually enter the machine name in a text field. And then because we really this one doesn't make any sense without these things. We're saying these are both required fields, right? We need to know the view machine name and we need to know the display name. Down here, same idea with the settings summary, getting the parent summary, and then we're adding our new field information to the settings summary. If there's a fallback view configured, show that. If the display is configured, show that. And then in our view elements method, similar to before, we're going to say, hey, give me the parents version of this field. And then if it's not empty, great, just return that. If it is empty, we're going to call our function get fallback view. And this is going to load our settings for our view name and our display ID if they're empty for some reason. Remember we made these required, so the only way these would be empty is if somebody tried to use this via code, or if they first set the field and they never clicked into the settings to alter them. We might not have those view name and the view display ID. So here we're just going to return nothing. If we wanted to be friendlier, we could, display a Drupal message or log an error or something. And then here, again, same idea. We're just returning our view render element with the view name and the view display. So now we don't need the is applicable method here because it's now generic enough. We could enable it on any entity reference field, right? And we could still say, hey, show me the teasers of this thing. But if they're empty, show this view instead. And here, there's just creating a custom field formatter documentation on Drupal.org that goes into some more detail on some of those specifics. So the next thing we have here, the next preprocessing option, is custom twig filters and functions. So twig filters are used to modify the variables in a twig template. Functions are used, they're similar. They're another way to modify the values in a twig template. Generally, the way I view them is if I am going to create a new thing that's not in the display, then I'm going to use a twig function to do that. If I'm going to alter something that's in the display, then I'm going to use a filter. And yeah, the twig custom functions and filters are really a lot easier to set up than you might think. So let's take a look. We're going to look at our simple example of adding a class to links in a field and how we might do that as a twig filter. So as part of this, we need to create a class, and then we need to create a service that recognizes that class and loads it into the Drupal service container. So this is in my module.services.yaml. Inside the services, you say my module.twig extension, right? The name of your module, and say it's a twig extension. Add the link to your class, like where it is, the namespace. And then you need to give it this tag twig.extension. That's sort of how Drupal knows that this is a twig doing extending twig. And then in our class here, my module twig extension, it's going to extend abstract extension. It could extend something else theoretically, but that's the sort of twig base extension class that you would extend. And then you can have a get filters function to define filters, and then a get functions to define functions. And in this case, it's just an array, and each array item here is a new twig filter, and then it's the name of the filter, like what you would use in twig. And then the second item is a link to a PHP method. In this case, we're saying use the add link class in this current, use the add link class function in this class. But it could be, a basic PHP function like trim, something like this. It doesn't need to be a method in your class. And so down here, we have our link class method. When you create a filter, the first parameter that's passed to your filter function is going to be the thing that you applied it to. So if we're applying it to a field, it's going to be the field items for the field here. And then the second and any further arguments here would be whatever you pass to it in the Drupal template. In the twig template. So we're going to apply it to a field, and then we're going to want to pass classes, right? Because that's what we want to add. So those are our only parameters. And so in this case, we've said that classes could be an array or a string, just to sort of keep things simple for Twig developers. You don't want to necessarily always have to be an array, but you want to allow people to have arrays. So the first thing we're going to do is just check if classes is an array. If it's not, it's a string, and we're going to turn it into an array. And then for, again, element, the helper class, we're going to get all the children of items. And then we're going to get its original classes, any classes that are already set on it. And then we're going to add our new classes. We're going to add original classes to the old classes. And then we're going to return items. And so how this might look in Twig is you might have a node template like this, where you render content without your link field. And then you can say content.fieldLink height to apply the filter. My module will add link class, and then in parentheses, the button class. The button class is what you want to add. So in this case, here, this is maybe an upgrade from preprocessing if you're working with Twig templates, because now it's not hidden somewhere in some module, some unknown module somewhere. It's right in the template. So if you're working with the templates, you can see that it's there. And then an alternate approach here is to use some variables. And so we're going to say, let's set field link with class equal to my content field with the class applied. And then down here, we're going to say set content, which is the generic content variable, equal to content. And then we're going to merge in we're going to override field link basically with our new field link with class. And so what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to down below just render content. So this is sort of, I would consider an upgrade approach here, because now you don't need to render your link separately, even though you altered it. Maybe, branching away from how it's configured in manage display. You still get to just render content down below. If you wanted to break it out, you still could. But now you don't have to worry about that ordering overrides, those ordering overrides. And then we're going to look at example 5b here. It's a simple Twig function. It's very similar setup to the filter. Again, we need the same services .yaml setup. And then it could even be the same class here, my module Twig extension. You could define any number of functions and any number of filters. And in this case, we're just adding a function, my module view. It's going to use the getView method in our class here. And this is similar. We've seen this before. We're just going to return a view element for the view name with the display ID and the arguments. So in this case, we have a few more arguments here. We have a view name, display ID, and the arguments, right? So now if we go down here, we can see we're setting our related articles variable equal to my module view. That's our new function, and we're passing it the view name and then the display ID. And then we're using the same tricks as before. We're going to then render that. And then if it's rendered, if it's real content, now we can add our nice wrapper to it and render it down. So again, we've seen a lot of these things, right? A lot of these methods, twig logic, preprocess hooks, display fields, field formatters, functions and filters. We've seen how to use them. We've seen that there's a lot of overlap. Almost all of our problems could be solved with multiple of those options. I mean, we looked at the literal same example for preprocess hooks, display fields, field formatters, and the functions and filters. So don't be concerned that there's one correct option. that's a little bit subjective, I think. If you ask me, I might say there's one correct way to do it. Somebody else might say another correct way, but I think most importantly, it's that you look at, how the community is doing stuff. If you're doing something completely different than the community, you just want to ask yourself why, and talk to some people about it, figure out why you're different. It may be that you're right, and then maybe the community will adopt it more, but maybe there's something you overlooked, right? So get familiar with all these different ways. Try them out. See how they feel. See how your coworkers feel about them, or any other peers. Discuss this stuff in Drupal Slack. Just get familiar with the options. Figure out how you feel about it. But I think the most important things are to consider its maintainability and to stay consistent. Like I said at the beginning, I've worked with a few different agencies, and they, had wildly different approaches. Like one agency, literally every display had a completely custom twig template. And that's fine, right? They work that way. They're consistent. It's how it works for them. It's great. There's all kinds of reasons to do that. So if I were to come in, and to start trying to use Display Suite and configuring all this stuff in the UI, that's going to make everybody's life more difficult, right? Because the things that I built are going to be built one way. The things somebody else built will be built a different way. It's going to be difficult to maintain. What happens when it changes in the future? What if somebody's not familiar with your new way? So you really have to be consistent on your project, consistent with your team members, and then document it. It's okay to try the different things. I've certainly been a part of projects where we're like, hey, this is our method that we use on every project, and then this new project, we've heard about this new approach, right? We want to try a layout builder for the first time. Let's do that on this site, and let's see how it goes, and we'll document how we did it. And then the next site, we might go back to the previous approach, right? That's okay. You're always going to be changing your opinion. You're always going to be, learning a new, better way to do it. But I would just encourage you to not change those things on a whim, on your own, in the middle of a project. Be consistent. That's the biggest thing. And that's it. All of these code examples are in this GitHub repository that I added. You can see here, again, all the code samples. Some of them may be helpful. I know some of them I've done multiple times for different teams and different projects, but I'll open up to questions. Any questions? Yep.
Is the real content filter, is that available, or you have to add it?
So the question is the real content filter available in core? And no, it's not. It's available. It's a contrib module. It's called Twig Real Content. So it should work here. So here it is, Twig Real Content module. Basically, it says, if one day this issue is solved in core, then this module will be obsolete, but they're not holding their breath. And then it will also say down here somewhere where it's the things that it considers to be real content, right? Like I mentioned, it's going to just check for like empty divs, etc. But these items are sort of all, they don't contain any inner HTML. They just are the thing. So this is what it considers. Any other questions? Chris?
Can you hook up a single directory component to a field formatter?
The question is, can you hook up a single directory component to a field formatter? And I do not know. Sorry. James?
Have you seen agencies document which approach they use, or do you just find that from inspection?
Have I seen agencies document which approach they use, or do I just find that through code? Lots of teams will have their own internal documentation. Some won't. I don't know that I've worked with many that have had like public-facing documentation. I'm sure there are some out there. Sometimes it will be in the project specifically, like in a README somewhere. But I think one of the things that can happen sometimes is, you as a developer, you're not necessarily tasked with documenting your decisions. You're tasked with doing the stuff. So sometimes it's, trying to think about when you're estimating something that you save enough time for yourself, you account for documenting it. So that's one approach. Yeah, just even a couple lines can be helpful. Like, hey, we use display suite on this site, so that's how our field templates are configured, except on these few pages, which were just so custom that we did them through custom twig templates using templates. And then that really helps. That helps new people coming in. Maybe they only saw the thing with the custom templates, and now they know, okay, that's really only for these extreme cases. Any other questions? Great. Thank you, everybody.